Samuel Carter pulled a dust-covered car to the gate of the city's most prestigious luxury auction, where gleaming supercars rested beneath golden lights like royal treasures. The attendants in tailored suits barely glanced at him before turning away. Madison Blake, the auction's director, studied his faded jacket and worn shoes, then refused him without a second thought. Xavier Grant laughed openly, calling it a rusted heap not worth towing to any junkyard. Nobody knew that inside the trunk was a file hidden for 40 years, and beneath the peeling paint lay a secret powerful enough to silence an entire room. Stay with this story until the end, because real value is sometimes buried beneath the deepest layers of dust. The event was called the Summit Collection, an invitation-only auction held once a year at the Hartwell Convention Center, a building whose marble floors and crystal chandeliers had witnessed some of the most significant automotive transactions in recent memory. Every vehicle on the program had been pre-approved months in advance: a 1968 Lamborghini Miura in perfect restoration condition, a custom Bugatti commissioned by a European royal family, a factory-fresh hypercar limited to 7 units worldwide. The guests who filed through the entrance had names that appeared on magazine covers and boardroom plaques, and they arrived in chauffeured vehicles accompanied by assistants who carried leather portfolios stuffed with bidding authorizations. Security personnel in dark suits stood at intervals along the rope line, their earpieces blinking with the frequency of a well-rehearsed operation. It was, by every visible measure, a gathering of the world's most powerful collectors, and Samuel Carter had driven 3 hours to be turned away at the gate. He had arrived just after noon, well before the evening program was scheduled to begin. His car, a 1962 coupe with oxidized burgundy paint, a chrome grille fogged with age, and a driver's window that didn't close all the way, sat at an awkward angle in the delivery lane, its engine ticking as it cooled. Samuel stepped out in a gray canvas jacket that had been washed so many times the original color was barely a memory, carrying a large manila envelope under one arm. He wasn't nervous exactly, more like a man who had rehearsed his lines for years and knew the words well enough not to shake. He walked to the check-in table with the quiet, measured pace of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Madison Blake was the kind of woman who controlled a room by simply standing in it. At 44, she had spent 2 decades building the Hartwell auction into the most respected private automotive sale in the country, and she understood that reputation was maintained not only through what she included in the program but through what she refused. She saw Samuel before he reached the table, processed him in less than 3 seconds, and had already decided before he opened his mouth. Her gaze moved from the envelope to his jacket to the aging car behind him, and when he explained that he wanted to register a vehicle for the evening auction, she paused just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. She told him that all submissions had closed 6 weeks prior, that the program was full, and that unverified vehicles could not be presented to the floor. The smile she gave him was practiced and final. Xavier Grant had made his fortune in logistics and spent a significant portion of it building one of the most talked-about private car collections on the East Coast. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, and accustomed to being the most important man in any room he entered. He had arrived early that afternoon to inspect the evening's lots and was standing near the entrance when he noticed Madison's exchange with Samuel. Xavier walked over the way someone might wander toward a distraction, not because he was curious, but because he enjoyed being present for things that confirmed what he already believed about the world. He looked at Samuel's car, let out a single soft laugh, and said the car wasn't worth the tow fee to remove it from the premises, loudly enough for nearby staff and the 2 other guests who had drifted over to hear him clearly. The comment drew a few muted smiles from the small crowd that had gathered. Samuel did not respond. He looked at Xavier for a moment, then looked back at his car with an expression that was difficult to read, part grief, part certainty, the look of someone who had been told he was wrong before and had learned to wait rather than argue. He tucked the manila envelope more tightly under his arm and stood still, as if he had decided that moving was the same as giving up. Madison signaled to a security guard, who began walking toward the vehicle with the clear intention of directing it toward the service exit. Samuel raised his hand, quietly, and said he wasn't leaving yet. The story of the car did not begin with Samuel. It began with his father, Joseph Carter, a man who had spent his entire working life in a 2-bay garage on the edge of a small Ohio town, doing the kind of mechanical work that most people took for granted and few could replicate. Joseph was not a wealthy man by any conventional measure, but he had a gift, a deep, almost intuitive understanding of engines and metalwork that had earned him a quiet reputation among collectors and restorers in the surrounding counties. He had the kind of hands that could identify a problem by sound before a diagnostic tool could find it, and the kind of patience that allowed him to spend a full month rebuilding a single carburetor. He was, in the language of his trade, exceptional, and he had spent most of his life being exceptional in places where that didn't translate into recognition. In the winter of 1978, a man had arrived at Joseph's garage in a truck, towing a covered vehicle on a flatbed trailer. The man gave very little information about himself, paid in cash, and asked Joseph to store the car and perform basic preservation work until he returned. He left a sealed envelope with instructions and a phone number that was later disconnected. He never came back. Joseph waited 3 years, attempted without success to locate the man, and then began to understand that the car had been left in his custody not by accident but by someone who had wanted it to disappear without destroying it. Whatever the reason, the car had found its way to a garage on a quiet Ohio street, and Joseph Carter had made a promise not to the man who left it, but to the car itself, to the history contained within it, that he would keep it safe until the right moment came. Samuel was 11 years old the first time his father let him sit inside the car. He remembered the smell of the interior, old leather and something else, something metallic and faintly chemical, like a document room in a courthouse. He remembered his father standing beside the open door, speaking softly, telling him that some things looked ordinary to people who didn't know what they were looking at, and that looking without understanding was the same as being blind. Joseph never told Samuel exactly what the car was, only that it required protection, and that one day the truth would have enough room to breathe. Samuel had grown up with that instruction the way other children grew up with family maxims, not fully understanding it, but treating it with the reverence of something sacred. Joseph Carter died in the early spring of 2009, from a cardiac event so sudden that there was no time for a final conversation, no opportunity for the revelation Samuel had been quietly waiting for without quite knowing he was waiting. He left behind the car, the garage, a worn leather journal with entries that were more technical than personal, and a metal toolbox in which, tucked beneath a set of socket wrenches and a coil of safety wire, Samuel found a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter in Joseph's handwriting, brief and deliberate, naming Eleanor Hayes, a specialist in rare and pre-production automobiles then working with an institute in Connecticut, and stating that if the car ever needed to be understood by someone other than Joseph, she was the person to call. For nearly 15 years, Samuel had done nothing with that information. He had kept the car in the same garage, covered with the same canvas dropcloth, servicing it occasionally to prevent mechanical deterioration but otherwise leaving it undisturbed. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed at once. His employer downsized without warning, eliminating his position along with 112 others. His sister Hannah, who lived 40 miles away, had been diagnosed with a degenerative joint condition that required ongoing treatment not fully covered by her insurance. The house Samuel had grown up in, still in his name, still carrying the weight of its own financing, was approaching a point where the numbers no longer worked. He was not a man who asked for help easily, and the idea of selling the car felt like a betrayal. But in the toolbox letter, Joseph had left him one instruction he had not followed: find Eleanor Hayes. It was that name that had finally pushed Samuel toward the Hartwell auction. He had located Eleanor after months of deliberate searching. She had since moved from Connecticut to a position consulting for private collections and major auction houses. He had called her office 3 times before reaching her directly, described the car in careful detail, and listened to the change in her breathing through the phone. She had not committed to anything, but she had asked a series of technical questions with the focused precision of someone already thinking faster than the conversation could move. She told him to bring the car to the Hartwell event, that she would be present. Samuel had driven 3 hours and arrived to find the gate closed against him, but Eleanor Hayes had not yet arrived. Samuel remained at the edge of the delivery lane for nearly 20 minutes after Madison's security guard had first approached him. He had not moved the car, had not raised his voice, had simply stood beside the vehicle with the patience of someone who understood that leaving now would mean the decision had been made for him. Madison had returned to her duties inside, confident the situation had been resolved by institutional inertia, that Samuel would eventually accept the outcome and drive away. She was wrong. When the second security guard arrived, Samuel asked again, quietly and without anger, for the opportunity to speak with the technical review committee, and was told again, with the kind of firm and practiced politeness designed to feel like courtesy while functioning as a wall, that the review window had closed. The crowd near the entrance had shifted, as crowds tend to do, from one small drama to the next. A few people who had witnessed the initial exchange had moved on. Others had arrived and picked up the ambient awareness that something had not quite resolved itself. A pair of guests in evening wear stood at a slight distance, watching without appearing to watch. One of the event's junior coordinators, a young woman named Paige, kept glancing at Samuel from behind her clipboard with the expression of someone enforcing a policy she didn't fully believe in. Xavier Grant, who had wandered away briefly to examine a 1972 Ferrari coupe in the pre-show staging area, came back. He had not forgotten about Samuel. He rarely forgot about things that had amused him, and when he saw that Samuel was still there, something in him shifted from amusement to mild irritation. Xavier walked toward Samuel with the relaxed authority of a man in his own territory. He offered to buy the car on the spot for $500, framing it as generosity, as doing Samuel a favor by taking a useless object off his hands before he embarrassed himself further. He smiled as he said it, the kind of smile that assumes the other person has no option but to appreciate it. Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then said no, simply and without explanation. The simplicity of the refusal seemed to confuse Xavier, who had expected either gratitude or argument and received neither. Xavier's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He added something else, something dismissive about the car's condition, about the impracticality of sentiment, and Samuel didn't respond to that either. The silence was not hostile, but it was very firm, and it had the quality of something that couldn't be moved. Madison, alerted by staff that the situation at the entrance had not resolved, reappeared with 2 additional security personnel. She told Samuel directly that the car needed to be relocated to the external parking area, that it was creating an obstruction, and that if he refused she would be forced to contact the venue's facilities management team to have it moved. She spoke in the measured, low tone of someone who dealt with difficult situations regularly and had developed a precise calibration for how much pressure to apply. Samuel was listening, and was about to respond, when a black car pulled up behind him and a woman in her late 50s stepped out with the unhurried efficiency of someone accustomed to walking into complicated rooms. Eleanor Hayes had the posture of a person who had spent decades leaning over engine compartments and bending into cramped chassis spaces, straight-backed in a way that suggested hard-won ergonomics rather than vanity. She was carrying a leather bag and wore the expression of someone who was already working. She acknowledged Samuel with a nod that communicated both recognition and urgency, then walked directly toward the old car without addressing Madison or Xavier. She moved around the passenger side slowly, tracing the roofline with her eyes without touching the paint. She stopped at the front quarter panel, leaned closer, then straightened. She moved to the hood, spent a moment examining the ornament mounting point where the original badge had once sat, and then turned to face Madison with an expression that was not quite accusatory and not quite amused but somewhere between the two. She said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words the way a surgeon selects instruments, that the event needed to pause on this vehicle. Madison stared. Xavier made a sound between a laugh and a dismissal. Eleanor didn't look at him. She looked at Samuel and asked, "Did he have the paperwork?" Samuel reached into the manila envelope and produced a small collection of documents, the original bill of sale on paper so old its edges had softened into fiber, 3 black and white photographs, and a handwritten note on the letterhead of a company whose name Eleanor recognized immediately, and whose existence had officially ended in 1964. Eleanor held each item at arm's length and read without speaking. The photographs showed a car in an unfinished state, primed but not painted, doors removed, interior frames exposed, sitting inside a building that appeared to be an industrial facility. In one photograph, a man in a work coat stood beside the open hood, his face partially turned from the camera. Eleanor studied that photograph for longer than the others. She then returned to the car itself, and what followed was a 30-minute examination conducted with the focused silence of someone reading a document in a language that most people had forgotten. She checked the VIN plate first, photographing it twice from different angles. Then the door hinges, specifically the way the pin had been manufactured, with a double crown head inconsistent with standard production tooling of the period. She examined the interior window channels, the profile of the dashboard, the arrangement of the instrument cluster, which had several positions that didn't align with any production variant she had encountered. She lay partially on the ground to trace a welded seam along the subframe that ran in a pattern consistent with hand fabrication rather than press tooling. Every detail she checked seemed to confirm something she had been quietly hypothesizing since Samuel's phone call months earlier. The car was not simply old. It was not a well-preserved production model or an unusually original survivor. It was something far more specific, the last known physical iteration of a prototype program that had been cancelled without public announcement in the spring of 1964, a program whose paperwork had been partially destroyed in a warehouse fire and whose vehicles were believed to have been scrapped as part of a corporate asset cleanup. The program had a name known only among a small community of serious automotive historians, and the car's existence, if confirmed, would constitute the most significant discovery in the field in at least 2 decades. Eleanor had spent parts of her career researching this program. The possibility that the final prototype had survived, stored in an Ohio garage by a mechanic who had received it from a stranger and kept his promise in silence, was the kind of discovery that did not happen more than once in a lifetime. Madison had followed Eleanor at a cautious distance during the examination, keeping close enough to monitor without interfering, and had begun to understand that something was happening here that required her attention in a way that had nothing to do with the event timeline. She had also begun to understand, with the quiet dread of someone watching an error become an incident, that she had nearly sent this vehicle to the street parking lot. Xavier Grant had repositioned himself near the entrance doors, close enough to hear but maintaining the visual posture of someone not particularly invested. He had caught enough of Eleanor's technical language to understand that the situation had shifted, and his response to that shift was not curiosity but calculation. When Eleanor paused to write in her notebook, Xavier moved closer to Samuel and said in a low voice that he would be willing to discuss a private purchase before things got complicated, a fair number, he said, significantly above what Samuel would receive at auction once fees were factored in. Samuel listened to him finish, then shook his head. He told Xavier that money was not the primary consideration, that his father had kept this car safe for 40 years, not so that it could change hands quietly in a parking lot, and that he intended to see the process through wherever it led. Xavier absorbed this with the thin patience of a man who could not understand being turned down and categorized the refusal as naivety. He stepped back without responding, and Samuel watched him go with the same steady expression he had worn all day, not triumphant, not contemptuous, just certain. Eleanor pulled Samuel aside and spoke to him directly for the first time since her arrival. She told him what she believed she was looking at, using precise language without dramatizing it. She told him that if the documents were authentic, and if the features she had observed were consistent with the records she had access to, then the vehicle was likely to be confirmed as the sole surviving example of a prototype that the automotive world had classified as lost for over 60 years. She said the word confirmed carefully, noting that authentication would require additional experts and documentation review. But she said it, and the weight of it settled over Samuel like something he had been waiting to hear without knowing it. He didn't speak for a moment. He looked at the car. Then he looked at Eleanor and said that his father had always known. The room they used for the emergency assessment was a staging area behind the main ballroom, a wide, brightly lit space normally used for lot preparation, with roll-up industrial doors and floor-mounted inspection lighting rigs. Samuel drove the car inside at Eleanor's direction while 2 of the venue's senior staff relocated 3 pre-staged auction vehicles to make space. Within 40 minutes, Eleanor had contacted 2 additional specialists. Martin Oakes, a professor of automotive history at a university in Michigan who had published extensively on pre-production prototype vehicles of the 1960s, and a woman named Ruth Calloway, an independent authentication consultant who worked regularly with several of the largest private collections in North America. Both had been at the event as guests and both arrived in the staging area within 20 minutes of Eleanor's call, their evening wear conspicuously at odds with the industrial lighting. The assessment proceeded in phases, with each expert working independently before comparing observations. Dr. Oakes spent the first 40 minutes on the documentation, setting the photographs and paperwork side by side on a portable work table and examining them with a magnifying loupe he had retrieved from his coat pocket. The bill of sale carried a distinctive format used by a specific regional transaction agent active in Ohio and western Pennsylvania in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a format he recognized from research on a separate project years earlier. The letterhead on the handwritten note corresponded to the formal stationery design used by the development division before its dissolution, a design detail that had never been made publicly available. Ruth Calloway concentrated on the vehicle itself, working in a methodical circuit from front to rear, examining every external surface and then the interior in close detail. What Ruth found in the interior matched what Eleanor had flagged, and went further. The seat material was not standard automotive upholstery from the period. It was a proprietary blend developed for an aviation interior contract and repurposed for the prototype program in limited quantities. This material had a specific weave pattern visible only under direct illumination, and it appeared nowhere in the documented production history of any commercially sold vehicle. The instrument cluster contained 2 gauges whose dial faces bore manufacturer markings not found on any other vehicle in any catalog Ruth had access to. Then, at the rear of the cabin behind the driver's seat, Ruth located a panel that did not appear to serve any structural function. She ran her fingers along its edges, found the release, and the panel opened. Inside was a cylindrical metal case approximately the size of a large thermos, sealed with a mechanical latch that required specific alignment to open. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a roll of photographic film in its original container, a folded set of technical drawings on drafting paper, and a sealed letter. The letter was addressed to no one, written in the hand of a man whose signature at the bottom matched the signature on correspondence, archived in 2 separate automotive history collections. A designer whose work had defined an entire era of American performance vehicles, and who had died in 1971 without, as far as the historical record showed, having completed the project that bore his name. The letter was brief, written in the cadence of someone who expected to return and finish what had been started, and it described the vehicle as the last complete iteration of his concept, built by hand over 14 months, placed in the care of someone he trusted because the company that had commissioned the project had decided to abandon it, and he could not allow the work to be destroyed. The 3 experts looked at one another across the hood of the car. Dr. Oakes removed his glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on. Ruth sat on the edge of a nearby equipment cart and said nothing for a moment. Eleanor folded her arms and looked at Samuel, who was standing near the roll-up door with his hands in his jacket pockets. He had been watching the entire assessment without speaking, and now, when the silence had stretched past the point where it needed to be filled, his eyes were red at the edges in the way that happens when someone is holding something very carefully that they have been carrying for a very long time. Madison Blake entered the staging area while the experts were reviewing the draft drawings. She had received 3 brief updates from Eleanor's assistant, each more significant than the last, and by the time she walked through the door she understood enough to know that the situation had moved well past her authority to manage alone. She looked at the car for a long moment, then at Samuel, and the expression on her face was one she did not have a practiced version of, something unguarded and genuinely unsettled, the expression of a person confronting the direct consequence of a mistake that cannot be undone but has not yet finished unfolding. Xavier Grant appeared at the staging area door shortly afterward, requesting that his own consultant review the documentation before any determination was finalized, citing procedural neutrality. Eleanor acknowledged the request without warmth and said that all documentation would be subject to independent forensic verification as part of the standard authentication process, and that all parties would have access to the results. Xavier remained in the doorway for another moment, then withdrew. In the quiet of the staging room, with the car sitting beneath the inspection lights and the sealed letter lying open on the work table, Samuel Carter allowed himself, for the first time since arriving that morning, to breathe. The decision to include the car in the evening program was made by Madison 40 minutes before the doors opened to the main floor, not as an act of generosity but as a professional acknowledgement of what the preliminary authentication had revealed. She had the car transported to the staging area adjacent to the stage under Eleanor's supervision and personally oversaw the arrangement of the lighting rigs. The car would appear in a special classification appended to the end of the program, introduced not as a standard auction lot but as a historically significant discovery, language carefully agreed upon between Madison, Eleanor, and the event's legal counsel. None of the standard program materials had been updated. The car's appearance would be an announcement, not an advertised item. The main program proceeded as planned. 14 vehicles moved through the floor in succession, each receiving the careful presentation and precisely modulated bidding energy that the Hartwell auction had built its reputation on. Guests circulated. Representatives of international collections made their phone bids through the coordinated relay of event staff, and the evening accumulated the specific atmosphere of concentrated wealth moving slowly and deliberately. Xavier Grant sat in the fourth row with the focused composure of a man managing several conversations simultaneously. His phone buzzed at intervals, and he responded to each message with the rapid efficiency of someone deploying resources in advance of something he intended to control. When the final standard lot closed, Madison took the podium herself, something she rarely did. The shift in the room was immediate. Guests who had begun the small movements of an evening concluding stopped moving. She said without extended preamble that the program had one additional item to present, that it was unscheduled, that it had arrived that day, and that the circumstances of its arrival and the nature of what it represented would be explained by a colleague before the bidding opened. She stepped back and Eleanor Hayes walked to the podium. Eleanor was not a performer and did not present herself as one. What she did was explain, with the clear and authoritative fluency of someone who had spent 30 years building expertise in a narrow field, what the car was, where it had been, and why it mattered. She described the prototype program, the circumstances of its cancellation, the loss of the warehouse documentation, the decades of unsuccessful searches by collectors and historians. She described what the assessment had found, the material evidence, the construction details, the contents of the metal case, and she described the letter in terms precise enough to convey its significance without reading it aloud. The room, which had been socially animated minutes earlier, went very still. On the large screen above the stage, the projection team displayed the images prepared during the assessment, the black and white photographs from Samuel's envelope showing the car in its unfinished state at the facility, photographs taken that afternoon of the VIN plate and the technical drawings, and one image retrieved from a university archive by Dr. Oakes, a photograph from 1963 showing the designer at his studio, and visible in the corner of the image, partially obscured by equipment, the unmistakable outline of the car's front quarter panel. Then the screen showed one more image. It was a photograph that Samuel had found among his father's personal documents, Joseph Carter standing next to the car in the garage in Ohio, taken sometime in the early 1980s by the look of the light and the quality of the film. Joseph was not smiling at the camera. He was looking at the car, with one hand resting lightly on the hood, in the way that people touch things they have been trusted to keep safe. Samuel was seated at a table to the right of the stage. He had not been told his father's photograph would appear on the screen. When the image appeared, he turned his face slightly toward the wall for a moment, then turned back. He pressed his lips together and looked at his hands on the table, and then he looked at the car, which sat in the center of the stage floor under the most precise and flattering lighting the venue could provide. It looked different under those lights, older and more significant, the way certain objects become more legible when they are finally placed in the right context. Xavier Grant, in the fourth row, watched the screen and then watched Samuel. His expression was composed, but his jaw had tightened in the way that happens when a person is confronting a position they constructed against a situation and now finds that position untenable. Madison, standing to the side of the stage, kept her eyes on the floor. The lights on the car did not make it look restored or glamorous. They made it look like what it was, something old and irreplaceable and real. The opening bid was set at $1.2 million, a figure that acknowledged the preliminary authentication while leaving room for the market to establish its own verdict. In a standard auction, an opening bid at that level for an unregistered vehicle with provisional certification might have drawn hesitation. In this room, on this evening, it drew immediate response. The first bid came from a representative seated in the second row, acting on behalf of a European collector who had been on the phone with his contact at the venue since Eleanor's presentation began. The second came from Xavier Grant, delivered with the deliberate composure of a man who had entered the building that morning, expecting to be the dominant presence in the room, and was not willing to revise that self-assessment. What followed was 22 minutes of bidding that the Hartwell staff would discuss for years afterward. The bids came from the floor, from phone representatives, and from 3 international collectors patched in remotely after their contacts alerted them during Eleanor's presentation. The increments were large, rarely less than $50,000, often in multiples of 100,000, and the pace of escalation was faster than anything the main program had produced. Madison stood at a position where she could see both the bidding board and the room, and at the 12-minute mark she exchanged a look with her senior coordinator that communicated, without words, that they were watching something they had not adequately prepared for. Samuel had been told gently by one of the event staff that he could watch from the table to the side of the stage. He nodded and took his seat, but he was not watching the bidding board. He was watching the car. It sat in the center of the stage floor with the stillness of an object that had outlasted most of the people who had ever touched it, and Samuel found himself thinking about the mornings in his father's garage, the quality of the light through the high windows in winter, the smell of machine oil and cold concrete, the sound of his father's voice, low and steady, explaining something about the car that Samuel had been too young to fully understand. The car had been the sight of those mornings. The car had held them. And now it sat under stage lights in front of 200 people who had never heard of Joseph Carter until 40 minutes ago, and the number on the board was climbing past 2 million. Xavier Grant was not a sentimental man and did not allow himself to be guided by anything he would have classified as emotion. What drove his bidding was not desire for the car. He had dozens of vehicles and this one didn't fit the visual logic of his collection, but the refusal to be outmaneuvered. He had been in the room that morning when the car was turned away. He had made the joke. He had made the offer. He had been turned down twice. The idea that someone else would claim the object he had dismissed, at a price that would make the dismissal famous in exactly the circles where his reputation mattered, was not a thing he was able to accept without resistance. He bid past 3 million with the steady expression of someone unwilling to show the ceiling. The call that changed the outcome came from a phone representative near the back of the room, a woman who had been on a continuous call for the past 15 minutes. She raised her hand at $3,400,000 and the increment she announced, $400,000 above the current bid, created a pause in the room that lasted nearly 4 seconds, which is a very long time in an active auction. Xavier's jaw moved. He looked at the bidding board, looked at his phone, and placed a counterbid at $3,900,000. The phone representative consulted briefly, then raised her hand again. $4,500,000. The room did not gasp. This was not the kind of room that gasped, but the air changed in a way that was almost physical, the way air changes before weather. Xavier looked at his phone for nearly 30 seconds. The entire room understood that something was being weighed, and when he placed his next bid, $4,700,000, his voice was flat in a way that communicated the bid was real but the certainty behind it was not. The phone representative answered without pause. $5,200,000. Xavier Grant did not counter. He set his phone face down on his knee and looked at the stage. The hammer fell at $5,200,000, the highest price ever achieved at the Hartwell auction, by a margin of more than $1 million, for a car that had arrived in the delivery lane that morning in a condition that had led to jokes about tow fees. The room's response was not explosive celebration but something more controlled and in some ways more significant. A sustained, building wave of applause from 200 people who understood what they had just witnessed, mixed with the particular charged quiet of individuals recalibrating something they thought they had understood. Samuel heard the hammer, heard the number announced, and looked at the car one final time from his seat beside the stage, not with the expression of a man who had won something, but with the expression of a man who had kept a promise. Xavier Grant rose from his seat quietly, gathered his jacket from the back of the chair, and left the room while the applause was still building. No one called after him. No one needed to. The room had rendered its judgment the way rooms like this always do, not with words, but with numbers, and with the particular silence that follows a number so large it becomes a kind of sentence. Madison Blake watched him go, and then looked at Samuel, and the expression she wore was one she would carry for a long time, not guilt exactly, but the permanent knowledge of what a first impression had almost cost, and what it had in fact revealed about the limits of the judgment she had trusted all those years. The buyer was not identified to the floor that evening. The institution she represented released a formal statement 2 days later. The Whitmore Automotive Heritage Museum, a nonprofit institution based in the Mid-Atlantic with a collection focused on American performance vehicle history and engineering documentation, had acquired the car with the specific intention of placing it in a permanent exhibit dedicated to the prototype era. The statement named the vehicle not by any marketing designation but by its project code, a technical identifier that historians recognized immediately and that generated, in the specialized press, a response that continued for weeks. More significantly, the museum's statement included a line that had been specifically requested by the curatorial director after reviewing the documentation. The permanent exhibit would credit Joseph Carter by name as the final custodian of the prototype, the man whose decades of quiet stewardship had preserved what would otherwise have been lost. Samuel read the statement in his car, parked in the lot of a gas station off the interstate on his drive home. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the passenger seat and sat still for a long time, watching the ordinary traffic move past on the road in front of him. He thought about what his father would have said. Joseph Carter was not a man who sought recognition. He had spent his life doing essential work in a place where recognition was not the currency, but there was a difference between a man being unseen and a man's contribution being unrecorded, and Joseph had deserved to be recorded. The statement from the Whitmore Museum put his name on the record. Samuel thought that was probably the thing Joseph would have wanted most, more than any price, more than any appraisal. In the weeks that followed, Samuel used a carefully allocated portion of the proceeds to clear the outstanding balance on the family house, which he decided to retain rather than sell. He used another portion to establish a treatment plan for Hannah that covered her ongoing care without the constant financial pressure that had been reshaping her daily life for the past 2 years. He contacted a vocational training foundation in his county and made a substantial contribution in his father's name, directed specifically toward mechanical trades programs for young people from low-income backgrounds, the kind of training that produces the kind of work Joseph Carter had done, the kind of skill that tends to be undervalued in proportion to how essential it actually is. The foundation agreed to designate the contribution as an endowed fund and attach Joseph's name to it formally. Madison Blake called Samuel 3 weeks after the auction. She opened the conversation by saying that she owed him an apology she wanted to deliver personally, and that the decision she had made at the gate that morning had been based on appearances and had been wrong. Samuel listened. He told her he appreciated the call. He did not tell her it didn't matter, because it had mattered, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, but he also did not extend the conversation into territory it didn't need to enter. He accepted the apology and said goodbye and set his phone down on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and sat with the specific quiet of a person who has chosen to be finished with something. Xavier Grant issued no statement and made no calls. He returned to the management of his collection and the maintenance of his reputation in the circles where it operated, and he was observed at subsequent events with the careful composure of someone who has learned that a particular subject requires particular avoidance. The people who had been in the room that evening, who had heard him laugh in the delivery lane that morning and then watched the hammer fall at $5,200,000 on the car he had called a heap not worth towing, they knew what they had seen, and they knew what it meant, in the way that careful people always know, even when no one says it plainly. Samuel drove to the Whitmore Museum for the first time on a Thursday morning in late autumn, alone. He had been invited to the formal opening of the exhibit months in advance, but he had wanted to visit once before then, when it was quiet, when the car would be surrounded by the attentive calm of a place that took preservation seriously rather than the social density of a public event. He was shown to the gallery by a junior curator named Marcus, who was young enough to have learned about the prototype only through the documentation that had arrived with the car, and who spoke about it with the reverence of genuine discovery. The car had been conserved rather than restored, a distinction the museum's conservation team had explained to Samuel in detail before beginning the work, and one that mattered to him. The surface was stabilized, the rust was sealed, the structural elements secured, the mechanical components preserved in place. But the paint was not refinished, the scratches were not filled, patina of 60 years of storage was not removed. The car looked, as it had in the garage in Ohio, like something that had lived through time rather than been protected from it. Samuel walked slowly around it in the gallery's low ambient light and found that it looked more itself here than it had anywhere, more complete. Somehow, in a room designed to hold history than it had ever been in a garage designed to shelter tools. The placard beside the car described the prototype program. The designer, the circumstances of the project's cancellation, and the car's journey from the facility in 1964 to a garage in Ohio, through 4 decades of careful preservation, and to the Hartwell auction. Near the bottom, in a section the curator had titled Custodian, was the paragraph about Joseph Carter, who he was, what his skill had been, and why the car's survival was in large part a consequence of his character, his care, his patience, and his willingness to keep a promise to something that could not ask to be kept. Samuel stood in front of that paragraph for a long time. Eleanor Hayes had told him something during the assessment, when the two of them were standing alone for a few minutes while the other experts consulted. She had said that in her experience, the objects that carried the deepest histories were almost never the ones displayed in the most prominent places. They were the ones held by ordinary people who understood their value and chose, at personal cost, to protect it. She had not meant it as consolation. She had meant it as a professional observation, the kind of thing you say when 30 years of work have shown you the same truth from enough different angles that it stops feeling like opinion and starts feeling like fact. But it had stayed with Samuel the way things stay when they have the structural quality of truth. Samuel walked out of the museum into the autumn light and drove home along roads he had known all his life, and felt, for the first time in years, that the weight he had been carrying had not been removed but had been placed exactly where it belonged.